Thank you so much for the kind invitation to this wonderful workshop and for the even kinder introduction. So this time we'll talk about Islamophobia. So certainly when to address the issue of anti-Muslim sentiments, to put it that way, there are different terminology to use. We can use hatred against Muslims or bias, anti-Muslim bias, or so on. However, in this case, we will talk about Islamophobia as a term which is used and I believe abused in recent time in many cases. And it's very often we experience that it was used as a weapon, a political weapon to discredit opponents, political and ideological opponents, but also a way to divide societies. Because at the end of the day, if the notion of prejudice is spread and addressed, that can be a problem for societies. However, in this case, we will not discuss the definition of Islamophobia, because as we will see, there's a proliferation of definitions. We will address those individuals, but mostly organizations, who claim the right to define what is Islamophobia and what isn't. Because at the end of the day, we see that for many organizations, it's a matter of authority, authority to define and to claim the right to define Islamophobia. So the term was basically first used in 1910 as an innovation in language, because it's of course it stems from the word Islam and phobia, a Greek word, which is referred to unbased fear of some entity. It was popularized by Edward Said, and most probably because of Edward Said's writing and calling the term Islamophobia, it became quite widespread. The original meaning back in colonial Algeria referred to those Algerians who already adopted Francophone culture, and some colonial individuals some negative attitude toward traditional Algerian culture. However, later on, the terminology developed further. It was first used in a political sense in the 90s in Great Britain by Runnymede Trust, where under the supervision of Home Secretary Jack Straw, there was an investigation and a report about the emergence of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim feelings in British society. And after 9/11, we see a worldwide proliferation of this terminology, starting from the US. Academia also developed an interest in Islamophobia, or at least in studying Islamophobia. It started in the United States as well. Certainly, Muslim advocacy had a history in the US back to 94, when the Council of American Islamic Relations were established in DC. And of course, it was very much framed in an American way. So it built on the basis laid down starting from the 60s, when it gets to right advocacy and so on. And when defining Islamophobia in the academic field and writing about Islamophobia, it was, to put it that way, very American. So there were comparisons to investigating Islamic groups and movement, to McCarthyism, and to negative attitude towards Muslim immigrants, compared to negative attitudes back then to Catholic Irish, Catholic Italian immigrants to the US. And of course, it had a very strong Saidian imprint, like it's inherited from the Orientalist notion of Western scholars. And since then, we see a huge proliferation in Islamophobia studies. We see very different definitions depending on the background of the author and his or her education. So there is now basically no consensus in academia about what does it mean to be Islamophobic and what does Islamophobia mean. However, there are some common notions and trait. So most of the literature agree that Islamophobia is structural and linked to policies, laws, and so on. Certainly it is linked to Edward Said's notion to Orientalism. It is, as I mentioned, it developed in the US. Therefore, they regard it as racialized, as Islam or being a Muslim is something which somebody born to and cannot get rid of. It's historical rooted according to their understanding that it draws from Orientalism and colonial past, and of course the politics that followed 9/11. It is discursive in the media, in films, and so on. There are recently a number of groups who are claiming the right to monitor Islamophobia or what they regard as Islamophobia in the Western world. I'm not going to talk about the US, going to move straight to Europe. So the first European country to monitor Islamophobia was the UK for many social, historical, and political reasons. So certainly the debate about non-European mass migration to the UK was there from the 60s, if we recall Enoch Powell's infamous Rivers of Blood speech. However, the 90s came as a shift in the discourse, a slow shift in the discourse in the UK, starting from the Rushdie affairs in '89, which put a spotlight on Islamism and the dangers of radicalization. And after that, the emergence of Mr. Islams in the UK, or self-declared Mr. Islams, who claim to speak in the name of the Muslims and put the religious layer of an individual's identity over all the others. Therefore, in 1996, the British Muslims and Islamophobia community was established under strong labor supervision, and a year later the first report about Islamophobia came out. In 2000, the Forum Against Islamophobia and Racism was established. However, the terror attacks in 2005 came as a change, and basically that was the time of Mr. Islams to flourish in the UK, and for individuals who claimed to have an impact on Muslim societies. Therefore, in 2005, Forum Against Islamophobia and Racism partnered up with the Muslim Council of Britain, which was very widely accused to have ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. So now we see that a group with potential Islamist ties started to claim the right to define who is Islamophobic and who is not, and try to address Islamophobia and use Islamophobia as a label on political and ideological opponents, just like the label of racism or anti-Semitism worked before. The British government was aware of the activity of the Muslim Council of Britain. Therefore, starting from 2012, they started to empower Tell Mama, which is basically a project of Faith Matters, which was basically the main partner of the British government. It was made up of liberal-minded British Muslims. However, because what we read from press releases, because of lack of transparency, the British government withdrew support from Tell Mama and empowered British Muslim Trust, MBT, to monitor Islamophobia on their behalf. If we investigate MBT, we see that it's funded by Rendry Charitable Trust and Aziz Foundation. Both of them are foundations founded by liberal-minded Muslims in London. Some of them are very much into real estate business to London. However, they are regarded as reliable partners by the British government. We can move to France, and a very similar pattern appears in France. So the pattern in the UK was, first of all, leftist group started to monitor Islamophobia in the framework of monitoring racism and other other kind of activities against minority groups. After that, some Islamists came into the picture. Then the government realized that things are not going well, and these people shouldn't be in power to use the label and political tool of Islamophobia. Then the government came in and basically entrusted their own people to monitor Islamophobia. So in France, we see that the Collective Against Islamophobia was established in 2003 by Sami Dabah, who was, according to even himself, was a member, a da'i at the Tablighi Jama'at before. Later on, he developed some strong ties, according to some allegations, to the Muslim Brotherhood. And indeed, he had some cooperation with the collective of Muslims in France, which is regarded as an umbrella organization very much affected by the Muslim Brotherhood, and also Tariq Ramadan, who we all know his activities well. Despite this fact, the United Nations provided them a special status and worked with them as consultants. However, when Emmanuel Macron pushed an initiative to nationalize Islam in France. Actually, it was started even before under the prime ministership of Nicolas Sarkozy. However, Emmanuel Macron revived this project. They tried to dissolve CCIF and entrusted the French Council of the Muslim Faith, which is the state-supported umbrella organization in France, to monitor actions and atrocities against Muslims. Of course, the French government and governmental organization are monitoring all kind of prejudice and atrocities and so on. However, they are in charge in monitoring the anti-Islamic activities. And now we can move to Germany, and I believe most of you are much knowledgeable than I am about the German situation. Therefore, I'm not going to get into the depth. However, for me as an outsider, it seemed to be apparent that some organizations linked to the Miligüris or the Muslim Brotherhood claim the right to monitor Islamophobia in Germany, and not to mention other organizations who, in a way or another, affiliated to the Turkish government. Certainly, there are global focus groups operating in this field. The United Nations historically has programs and organization monitoring any sort of discrimination, atrocities. In this framework, they started to monitor anti-Muslim atrocities after 9/11, when the debate about Islam and Islamism and Muslim immigration started to be heated in Europe. However, we see that basically this wouldn't happen without a pressure of specific countries, including Pakistan and Turkey, who are also key players in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, an alliance or group of 57 Muslim nations. And the Organization of Islamic Cooperation itself is quite active in monitoring Islamophobia. They have their dedicated webpage for that. Every year they publish their reports about it. And in 2010, there was a common declaration from the leaders of these countries. If we try to get into the depth of such reports, we see that they are quite diplomatic. And if we read the text of the declaration of the OAC ministers, we see that they tried to avoid confrontation for the very reason that these are nation states who have actually very diverse interests with different countries. Therefore, their reports, as far as I learned after reading basically half of them, and see the resources, the sources they use, they're much more based on press reports by state agencies and so on. So as far as I was concerned, they try to not use Islamophobia as a political tool, but they are just addressing the issue because they are regarded as an authority and the main assembly for Muslim nations. In the European Union also followed suit. So in the European Union, we see multiple organizations getting involved in monitoring Islamophobia. On the EU level, we usually see some NGOs who are active in this field. Many of them are openly affiliated and funded to left-wing and liberal NGOs, active worldwide. And now we get to Turkey, because basically Turkey emerged as a key international actor in monitoring Islamophobia, or what they regard Islamophobia on the global stage. So back in 2001, they pressed for including the term Islamophobia in the UN's language, and we see that basically President Erdogan is presenting themselves as a self-declared leader of not only Turks but Muslims generally, which very much went hand in hand with the Turkish foreign goals in the Balkans, in the Middle East, or also in Europe. It was basically the Ghazi protest era when the Islamophobia counter-narrative began to be used by Turkish politicians. It was a counter-narrative to what they regarded as Western hegemony, but basically Western criticism against some policies of the Turkish government. And also Islamophobia, or at least monitoring Islamophobia, emerged as a tool for mobilizing not only Turkish communities, but non-Turkish Muslim communities all around the European Union and European countries. So in 2015, SETA, which is actually a think tank very closely affiliated to the ruling party in Turkey, started the European Islamophobia report by a scholar from Turkish university and by Ferit Hafiz, who back then resided in Austria. And started from the 2000, we see an expansion in Turkey with this institution. So now the state news agency has a special department monitoring Islamophobia, and this is basically became quite well institutionalized. On the image, actually, we see President Erdogan giving a great speech after the Christchurch attack in New Zealand on a mosque. And he presented himself as a leader and defender of Muslims all around the world. We cannot see the background behind him, which is quite fortunate for us now, because on the background they were basically streaming the images which was recorded by the Christchurch shooter when he was walking to the mosque in a video game style. So you can imagine how emotional it has been back then. President Erdogan presenting himself as a defender of Muslims. Meanwhile, in the background, the audience saw footages of Muslims being massacred for their faith. I had the chance to discuss the process the reports of SETA are made with 3 individuals who were basically involved in writing these reports. What they agreed that, and this what you see now here is a copy-paste from the instructions which were given to them. However, all 3 individuals were they agreed that they received very little instructions. So basically, they were free to interpret all the happenings in their countries, which they investigated, according to their own preference. There were no fact-checking and there were no peer review. There was a grammatic check at the end and some structural suggestions from behalf of the editors. However, they agreed that they got completely free hand to define which act was can be regarded as Islamophobic and what isn't in the country. Therefore, there is a quite big space for interpretation and also to push forward in personal causes. I come from Hungary. I made an analysis about the chapters on Hungary in the recent years. And basically, I can say that it was full of false claims, outdated information, and so on. However, the authors of the report about Hungary both were researchers at the Central European University. And if you heard the story of Central European University in Hungary, you know that they are quite an opponents of the Hungarian government for being pushed out of Hungary because of their funding from open society foundations and so on. By the way, Central European University was also very much active at the time of the coup attempt in Turkey. They were very vocal in defending academic freedom in Turkey, and they were quite vocally anti-government and Turkey at that point. Still, we see that their researchers, when they find the time proper to write their notions about Hungary, they basically did so. And basically, this can be regarded as a tendency if we take a look on the front pages of the reports published in the last decade. We see that they started quite neutral. In 2017, we see images taken from a Pegida demonstration, which fairly could be blamed to be Islamophobic, if we want to stick with this word. However, later on we see they started to be quite political. So on the report of 2018, we see inner ministers of 3 European countries trying to counter mass migration and the migration crisis, which started in 2015. Still, it was framed as part of Islamophobia in Hungary. However, the debate was mostly about mass migration. And later on, and then we see Peter Hanke, who received the Nobel Prize, and he was accused for being a denier of the Srebrenica massacre, which was regarded to be an Islamophobic act. And later on, we see it got even more political. So if we take a look on the issue of 2020, we see they had President Emmanuel Macron on their front page after his declaration, and here you can see quotes from the report. The authors of the report were members of CCIF, an organization shut down by Emmanuel Macron, and you can see how personally they took these measures of the president. And here one can raise the question if we can regard this academic or less so. So certainly it was not only about France. If we take a look on the relations between Turkey and France, starting from the coup attempt in Turkey, we see that there was quite a tense relationship between President Macron and President Erdogan. For many reasons, and even they were clashes of interests in the Eastern Mediterranean gas wealth, how to benefit it. So actually, there's a great disagreement between the two governments. And at time when Emmanuel Macron talked about the crisis of Islam, it was obviously Turkey and the Turkish pro-government politicians who started to condemn his statements. And here, probably it's not a coincidence that he is on the front page of the Islamophobia report of 2020. And then we can move to Austria. As our colleague Ferdinand referred to in his previous presentation, there was it's also probably not a coincidence that Ferit Hafez chose to put the image of Sebastian Kurz on the front page after being personally affected by some policies of the Austrian government. Therefore, we see that, well, it's hard to see this issue not as a personal act of revenge by the author. Still, we see that this Islamophobia project had a lot of supporters from Starting from Turkey, of course, we see very different Turkish initiative being active in funding or contributing in a way to another to this project. Most of them are connected in a way or another to the Turkish government. And we also saw that for a year they partnered up with the European Union, but I believe Professor Schröter has more authority to talk about this issue and how this cooperation was ended between this project and the EU. After the Luxor, Operation Luxor, Farid Hafez decided to leave to the United States and to continue his academic life there. And since 2020, we see like that he basically built a strong alliance with in American academia, starting from Rutgers University or Berkeley and other American institutions to continue this project. So, and I would like to conclude here. So the main message of this presentation is basically that in the ongoing discourse about Islamophobia, it's not the main question is not always what is Islamophobia, but who has the authority to define what Islamophobia is. And thank you very much.
Thank you.